Hi there, welcome to Penn Central 99's channel. This is the continuing video series on building Sidewinder Junction, and today what we're going to do is we're going to install feeder wires to this section of track or area of track that we just laid the other session. Some of the items or tools that you're going to need to do some soldering work are obviously some soldering irons. I have two for a reason. This was my original soldering iron. It never came with a pencil tip, but it's got a fat tip that I can use for other applications. So I went and bought this pencil tip soldering iron, and now I have two. Obviously you're going to need some solder. This is 60-40 rosin core solder, 0.032 inch diameter. It's important that if you're going to solder electrical items that you get solder that's designed for electrical. Don't get solder that's for plumbing, because it's not going to work correctly. It may not even bond, or it's liable to screw up your work. Some of the other items that you can use is some flux. Not everybody uses flux, but when I solder feeder wires to track, I use flux. I got a wire brush here. The wire brush helps take the oxidation off the tip of the soldering iron. Some people like using a wet sponge to wipe it off, but excuse me, I prefer a wire brush, a X-Acto knife, and an old coat hanger. This old coat hanger's got a pointing tip here, and the other end has a loop on it for pulling the wire through. Since my bench work does not use plywood, it's merely 1x3 bench work with the 2-inch foam board, as you can see here over top. I just use this old coat hanger to poke down through the foam board, and then I attach the end of the wire to this and pull it completely through, and then solder it to the main bus line that runs underneath the bench work, and I'll show you that towards the end of the video. Last but not least, you're going to need some wire. This is some old speaker wire that I've had for years. This is solid core or solid 24 gauge speaker wire, which I use for my feeders. So let's go ahead and get started. To recap things a little bit, what we did the last session is added a switch or a turnout, a 3-foot section of flex track, and 2 more turnouts at this end. This turnout that you see here was existing, and you also can't see the feeder wire that was connected previously. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to install feeder wire here where these 2 turnouts connect. The 3-foot section of flex track has a gap in it to allow for expansion, either track expansion or bench work expansion. So I'm not going to solder that because I want that to move. And the gap is about the thickness of a piece of styrene or a credit card. I'm going to solder before the turnout, after the turnout, where these 2 connect, and also after again, because the insulated frogs for the turnouts have a tendency to allow power interruption. So I want feeder wires before and after each area of the turnout to help eliminate loss in power. Although I'm going to be soldering feeders to 3 separate joints or 3 separate track connections, I'm only going to show you the process for one. This is just repeated for the rest of the joints, and not just for this section of the layout, but the whole layout. So there's no point in showing you 3 times how to connect feeder wires. One of the tools I forgot to mention at the start that you're going to need is, obviously, we're going to need some wire strippers. You can see here that these wire strippers have different sizes for gauge, and what we need to do is not only cut the wire, but we need to strip the insulation off the wire. So before we feed the wire down through the bench work, I just need to strip off a little bit of the insulation. That way I'll be working with the bare section when we go to install the feeder wire. So to get this through the foam, I'm just going to take the pointed end of this coat hanger, and I'm going to come back just a little bit from the edge of where the joiner is, because I don't want it straight in. I want something to work with, and I'm just going to feed this down through. See how easy that pokes down through there? Okay, I'm already through the foam. I can feel that. So now that I'm got the hole poked, and you can see there's the loop end of it, I'm just going to wrap this wire through. You don't need much, just something, just to loop it. I'm reaching underneath the benchwork, which you can't see, and I'm pulling this down. And you see the wire feeding down through there, nice and easy. Okay, so now I can take that and bend that 90 degrees. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to install that in the end of that joint there. There you can see how that wire just fed in behind that rail joiner. Feed it through, and now I'm going to pull the slack of that wire down through the road bed and the foam. Okay, there's the white wire that's attached. And when we come back and paint the rail and install the road bed, that won't even be visible. Now let's do the side for the blue. Same thing, I'm just going to strip a little bit of the insulation off. Take the other end, wrap it and feed it. Now for those of you that use plywood in your bench work, you're going to have to probably drill holes to feed this down through. Bend it 90 degrees. I'm going to feed that in between the rail joiner and the rail. As you can see, I've got the blue feeder on. I just need to pull the slack and be gentle with this down through there, and you can see how well that's going to be hid when we get done. Okay, when it comes to start soldering, I just take my flux, and the flux and the solder, I bought a Radio Shack, but this flux is a gel. Okay, so I just take a toothpick and I get a little bit. You don't need a whole lot, and I just spread the flux on the joint, because what it's going to do is it's going to help flow that solder into the areas where you want it. So like I say, not everybody uses flux. I do when I solder rail. I don't use flux when I'm doing decoders and stuff because the wires are small. But for this application, I want it to flow, so we just spread it on there. Now I'm going to take my soldering iron with the pencil tip and use that to heat the joint. I want to put the heat right where I want it. I don't want to melt wires. And after this gets hot, and here's my solder, it's just going to flow right down into there. And you're going to see the solder flow. As soon as everything gets heated up to the same temperature, what you're doing is you're heating the rail and the rail joiner up to the same temperature so that the solder will flow into the joint. May take a couple of seconds, but it'll work. You can see that the solder is starting to flow into the joint. And what you can use the tip to move it along. And I don't know if you could see that flow into that joint there. See the solder flowing? And when you're done, should have a nice and shiny solder connection. And there's one side. We're going to do the same thing to the other side. There we have our solder connection. And when you get done, one of the things that you want to do is you want to clean it either with a bright boy or some rubbing alcohol to get those off of there. On the underside of the layout, you can see where the wires come down through. And like I said, for maintaining consistency on your wiring, even though I have red and black for my bus wires, the white and the blue for their connection is consistent. So to try and keep things simple, we grow up in life with bruises or black and blue marks, so my wiring schematic is black and blue and red and white. Now what I'll do is I'll take my X-Acto knife and strip back some of the insulation and make those connections. So I'm just going to take maybe about a ½ inch area and cut back the insulation with my X-Acto knife. I'm just going to roll that wire on that X-Acto knife, and I'm going to take the tip, and because this is braided wire, it's just going to split that that insulation, and then it's just going to peel back. Now you can see it peeling apart there. I'm using my fingers, and I'm just peeling apart the insulation. One thing that I do when I'm making my connections is I don't want my bare wire right next to each other. So what I'm going to do is when I peel this section of insulation back, I'm going to leave a gap so that if they ever do for some reason come together, the chances of a short are slim to none. Yeah, I could take some liquid tape or some electrical tape and cover those, but to me that's tedious and unnecessary, especially since I'm the only one working on the layout. So, like I say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the insulation here on this red wire and peel it back the same way as you see on that black wire. Okay, now that I have the insulation stripped back and also have the insulation stripped on my feeder wire, I'm just going to wrap these together so that when I solder it, I've got a nice, good connection. And all you need to do is just wrap this several times. I'm going to come on top of the red wire or the black wire and over to the red, so that when I make these connections, and all I'm doing is twisting this 24 gauge wire onto the bus wire. And as you can see there, I've got some nice T connections. Now, since I'm dealing with wire, I'm going to put a little bit of flux on these connections so that I can get that solder to flow once I start to heat this up. Okay, I've got some flux on there. And remember earlier I said I had two soldering irons, one with a really fat tip. Well, this is where the fat tip comes in handy. I'm just going to hold this together, and you can see the solder is already starting to flow. Now the smoke, I'm sure you can see it on the camera, but the smoke is from the flux. Okay, I'm not burning anything down, but you can see how that that solder just flows on there. Same thing for this connection. See the solder just flowing into that T connection here. And that's how I install my feeder wires from my bus to my track. Well, that's pretty much it for this edition of Building Sidewinder Junction. As you can see, installing feeder wires is pretty easy. I hope you learned something. I hope you can use it. And as always, thanks for watching.